At 11:17 a.m. over Germany, one American fighter turned back toward 26 enemy aircraft. Below him, 60 bombers carried 600 men home. He could leave and live. Instead, he stayed and changed the air war forever. At 11:17 a.m. over Germany, a single American fighter dove straight into 26 enemy aircraft. No wingman, no backup, no escape route. Just one P-51 Mustang cutting through the cold air at full throttle, flying directly into a storm of guns. Below him, 60 B-17 bombers were limping toward home. 600 men trapped inside aluminum shells, fuel-low defenses thinning already marked as targets. They were minutes from safety and seconds from disaster. The pilot above them had a choice. He had enough fuel to turn west, enough speed to live. One clean break, one smart decision, and he'd make it back to England. But if he stayed, he would be alone, outnumbered, and very likely dead. The Mustang didn't turn. For the next 37 minutes, one pilot, one aircraft, and one impossible decision would hold back an entire enemy force and change how air war was fought over Europe forever. This isn't the story of a machine. It's the story of a man who looked at the odds and refused to run. The pilot in that Mustang wasn't chasing glory. His name was James Howard, and just hours earlier, this mission had looked like any other. Escort the bombers in, stay with them as long as fuel allowed, turn back when ordered, live to fly again tomorrow. Howard had already flown deep into Germany before. He knew the routine. The escorts would peel off near the border. The bombers would press on alone. Losses were expected. That was the math of daylight bombing in 1944. But this time was different. Below him, the bombers weren't just dots on a map. They were men he could see, crews he could picture, ball turret gunners sealed inside glass spheres, pilots gripping throttles, hoping today wasn't their last. Howard watched German fighters forming above the formation. Too many of them, too coordinated, too patient. He checked his fuel. Enough to get home if he left now. Barely. He checked his ammunition. Full. 650 caliber machine guns, thousands of rounds. A powerful aircraft, but still just one. Then the Germans came. Not in a reckless charge, but with discipline. Formation leaders layered attacks, veterans with years of combat behind them. They weren't hunting the Mustang, they were hunting the bombers. Howard knew what that meant. If they broke through, dozens of aircraft would fall. Hundreds of men would die in minutes. Radio calls filled the air. Confusion, fear, silence. Howard pushed the throttle forward and turned back toward the enemy. He didn't announce it. He didn't ask permission. He simply placed his Mustang between the bombers and everything trying to kill them. From that moment on, there would be no safe choice, only the decision to stay. Howard hit them before they could fully commit to the bombers. The Mustang dropped out of the sun like a knife airspeed screaming past 400 miles an hour. He didn't chase stragglers. He didn't spray bullets. He went straight for the leaders, the pilots holding the formation together. 3 seconds on the trigger, 90 rounds. The German fighter's wing folded and vanished in a cloud of debris. Howard didn't follow it down. He never did. He climbed back up, traded speed for altitude, and came again. Dive, fire, extend away. The Mustang was faster than anything the Luftwaffe had at that height, and Howard used every knot of it. German pilots tried to turn with him. They couldn't. They tried to follow him in the climb. They fell behind. One by one, their formations shattered. Inside the bomber stream, gunners watched in disbelief. They'd seen escorts before. They'd seen fighters peel off at the border, leaving them alone over enemy territory. They had never seen one airplane move like this always, between the bombers and the attackers, never slowing, never breaking away. Howard pulled through another high G turn and felt the pressure crush him into the seat. His vision tunneled. Black crept in at the edges. He eased the stick just enough to stay conscious, just enough to keep fighting. German radios lit up. Calls for help. Calls for coordination. This wasn't a green unit being surprised. These were veterans, and they were being dismantled by a single fighter that refused to disengage. Howard checked his ammo counter, already dropping fast. He didn't slow down. Every second he stayed meant the bombers stayed alive. And as long as they were still flying, neither was he done. By the 13th minute, the fight had changed. Howard's Mustang was still flying, but it was no longer perfect. One of his guns froze solid, the metal seized by brutal cold and violent temperature swings. Then another. The trigger felt lighter now, too light. He checked the panel. Ammunition was disappearing faster than time itself. Below him, the bombers were still trapped, still slow, still vulnerable. Howard did the math without slowing down. He had fuel to leave, barely enough to reach England with reserves if he broke away now. The bombers at their speed were still more than half an hour from safety. If he stayed, he'd be running on fumes long before they crossed friendly lines. The Germans sensed it. They stopped scattering. They stopped panicking. Veteran pilots began to regroup, tightening their formations, changing angles, watching the Mustang instead of reacting to it. They had been fighting instinct. Now they were fighting patterns. Howard felt it immediately. Attacks came in layers, head-on passes to force him to break, diving elements waiting above his escape path. They were trying to box him in force. A mistake ended quickly. Standard tactics said, disengage, build speed, extend away. Howard ignored them. He stayed aggressive, more aggressive than before. He dove straight through formations instead of around them, forcing overshoots, turning chaos into his only weapon. When they tried to trap him, he reversed. When they expected him to run, he climbed straight at them, daring them to blink first. Inside the bombers, gunners stopped counting kills and started counting minutes. The Mustang was still there, still fighting, still drawing everything toward itself. Another gun jammed. Howard now had fewer barrels, less ammunition, and a fuel gauge that refused to be ignored. His hands were numb. The cockpit heater had failed. Oxygen pressure flickered. Every breath felt thinner. But the bombers were still flying. As long as they were airborne, Howard stayed between them and the enemy. Not because it was smart, not because it was survivable, but because leaving now would mean watching 600 men die behind him. And that was the one thing he would not do. By now, the Germans weren't trying to reach the bombers anymore. They were hunting the Mustang. 19 fighters circled above the formation, disciplined, patient, closing in tighter each minute. They'd lost comrades. They'd lost formation leaders. And now they understood something dangerous this American wasn't leaving. He was running out of time, fuel, and ammunition, but he wasn't backing down. Howard checked his guns. Only a few still worked. His ammo counter dropped into double digits. Seconds of fire left. Not minutes. Seconds. The Luftwaffe came in waves. Howard met the first head-on, firing a short burst at point-blank range. One enemy fighter erupted in flame, and fell away. He pulled vertical bled speed, then rolled and dove back down into the second wave before they could adjust. Another burst. Another aircraft crippled. But now the advantage was gone. He was lower, slower, beneath them instead of above. The Germans had altitude numbers and the sun. Tracers ripped past his canopy. Cannon rounds tore holes through his wings. The Mustang shuddered controls, turning soft and unresponsive. Howard fired again. Click. Silence. No recoil. No muzzle flash. His guns were empty. 18 German fighters closed in on an unarmed American plane. Any pilot would have run. Any doctrine said, disengage. Survival was still possible if he turned away now. Howard turned toward them instead. He dove at the nearest fighter with nothing but speed and nerve, closing so fast the German pilot broke in panic. Another followed, then another. The enemy began to scatter not because they were beaten, but because they didn't understand what they were seeing. A fighter that wouldn't fire. A pilot who wouldn't flee. Inside the bomber stream, crews watched the impossible unfold. The Mustang was still there, still pulling enemy aircraft away, still buying seconds, then minutes. Howard's fuel gauge crept toward empty. Oxygen thinned. His hands shook from cold and exhaustion. But the bombers were still flying. And as long as they were in the air, he would not leave them alone. The Germans finally changed their plan. If they couldn't kill the Mustang, they would ignore it. 8 fighters stayed high to keep Howard busy. The rest rolled over and dove straight for the bombers, throttles wide open. It was the right call. Brutal, efficient, textbook Luftwaffe doctrine. Howard saw the split instantly. He had no guns, barely any fuel, and only seconds to choose. Fight the fighters chasing him or save the bombers that couldn't run. He rolled toward the diving formation. The Mustang screamed downhill speed, climbing past 400 miles an hour. Howard lined up on the lead German fighter from behind, close enough to see the pilot's helmet, close enough to feel the prop wash. He didn't fire. He couldn't. But he didn't break away either. The German pilot looked back. No muzzle flashes, no tracers, just a silver nose filling his canopy. He broke hard. His wingman followed. The formation unraveled. Howard stayed on them, hurting, pressuring, forcing mistakes. One fighter dove away. Another rolled inverted and fled. One by one, the attackers peeled off, not destroyed, but neutralized by pure aggression. Above him, the remaining Germans dove. Howard pulled up to meet them, climbing until the Mustang hung on its propeller. Airspeed bled away. The stall warning screamed. Tracers ripped past his wings. One round punched through the tail. Another clipped an aileron. The aircraft shuddered violently. He shoved the nose down dove-built speed, then pulled back up behind them again. Fuel warnings flashed red. He had minutes left, maybe less. Then dots on the horizon. Dark shapes growing fast. Thunderbolts. Dozens of them. American fighters pouring in from the west. The Germans saw them too. At last, the attack broke. One by one, enemy fighters turned east and vanished into the distance. The sky fell quiet. Howard eased off the throttle hands, shaking, vision narrowing. His engine coughed. He leaned the mixture and prayed. Below him, 60 bombers flew on, scarred, damaged, but alive. Howard followed them home. He had nothing left to give, but it had been enough. The fight was over, but Howard didn't feel relief. As the bombers droned west, his Mustang trembled beneath him like an exhausted animal. The fuel gauge hovered just above empty. The engine sputtered once, then smoothed out as he leaned the mixture, coaxing every last drop from the tanks. His hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from cold oxygen debt and 37 minutes of unbroken combat. Below, the bombers held formation. They were damaged, scarred, but every single one was still flying. American fighters slid in around them, thunderbolts filling the sky at last. One pilot pulled alongside Howard and gave a thumbs up. Howard barely nodded back. He didn't have the strength for anything more. Crossing the English coast, his fuel warning light glowed red. When he finally touched down, the Mustang rolled to a stop with barely enough fuel left to taxi. The canopy opened. Cold air rushed in. Howard sat still for several seconds, then climbed out his legs, nearly giving way beneath him. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft. They counted the damage in silence. Bullet holes stitched across the wings and fuselage. Cannon strikes that had missed fuel tanks by inches. Frozen guns, empty belts. An airplane that should not have made it home. Howard walked around the Mustang with his crew chief answering questions with shrugs. When asked how many enemy fighters he'd destroyed, he hesitated. Maybe 3. Maybe 4, he said. Hard to tell in the fight. Across England, bomber crews were landing too. Men climbed out of aircraft they never expected to see again. And they all told the same story. One Mustang, one pilot, staying when no one else could. Intelligence officers compared reports, mission logs, gun camera footage. The truth became impossible to ignore. Howard hadn't just survived. He had held off an entire enemy force alone. And the war would never look at fighter pilots the same way again. What happened over Germany that morning didn't stay in the sky. Within hours, intelligence officers began piecing it together. Not from one report, but from dozens. Different crews, different aircraft, same story. A single P-51 Mustang had stayed with the bombers long after every escort should have turned back. It had fought alone, and it had never left their side. Gun camera footage confirmed it. 11 enemy aircraft destroyed, more damaged. But numbers alone didn't explain what the bomber crews described. They talked about time, about how the attacks never seemed to break through, about how the German fighters kept turning away as if something was holding them back. That something was James Howard. 2 days later, senior commanders arrived at the airfield. They wanted details. They wanted explanations. Howard gave them none. He downplayed it. Said he was just doing his job. Said it happened fast. Said he didn't remember much beyond staying with the bombers. They pressed harder. What they finally understood was this: Howard hadn't just fought bravely. He had rewritten the rules. Before that day, fighters stayed close, defensive, reactive. After January 11, 1944, escort doctrine changed. Fighters were unleashed, told to hunt, to dominate the air instead of merely shielding bombers from it. The Mustang proved it could do more than escort. It could control the sky. 6 weeks later, on a cold English morning, James Howard stood on the same airfield where his Mustang had limped home nearly empty. This time the engines were silent. The formation was ceremonial, and the metal placed around his neck carried words that could never fully capture what had happened. He was the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the Medal of Honor during the war, not for how many aircraft he destroyed, but for how many lives he brought home. 600 men walked away from that mission because one pilot refused to abandon them. And long after the smoke cleared and the war moved on, those men remembered one thing above all else: When everything else turned back, one Mustang stayed. The paperwork called it a mission. The men who flew it called it something else. In the days that followed, bomber crews began asking questions. Who was the pilot who stayed? What squadron? What name stories spread across airfields and mess halls? One Mustang. One man, 37 minutes. 60 bombers untouched. It sounded impossible until the crews started finding him. A week later, men from the bomber group traveled to Howard's base. They didn't come with cameras or commanders. They came quietly. Some shook his hand, some struggled to speak. One gunner told Howard he had watched the entire fight from his turret, counting every pass, every dive, certain he was witnessing his own last moments in the sky. He told Howard he was alive because that Mustang never left. Years later, that same gunner would name his first son James. Howard never talked much about that day. He flew more missions. He shot down more enemy aircraft. But nothing ever matched January 11th, because it was never about numbers. It was about staying when every instinct, every regulation, and every survival calculation said to leave. After the war, the Mustang became legend. Escort ranges stretched to Berlin and back. Bomber losses dropped. Air superiority shifted permanently. The Luftwaffe never recovered. And buried inside doctrine manuals and training lectures was an unspoken truth. Aggression, when guided by discipline and purpose, could change everything. Howard went on with his life. He tested jets, trained new pilots, served until the uniform finally came off. He lived long enough to see the world he helped shape and to know that what he had done mattered far beyond one mission. But on that January morning over Germany, none of that existed yet. There was only a sky full of enemies, a formation of bombers that couldn't defend themselves, and one pilot who made a decision that echoed through history. He didn't stay to become a hero. He stayed so others could go home. And sometimes that's how legends are born. Long after the war ended, the numbers faded. Sorties flown, aircraft destroyed, medals awarded, all of it blurred with time. But one thing never did the lesson of that morning over Germany. Every fighter pilot who trained after 1944 learned it whether they knew the name or not. Speed is life. Altitude is insurance. And when everything goes wrong, initiative decides who lives. James Howard understood that before it was written into manuals. He proved it not in a briefing room, but alone in the sky with empty guns and a failing engine, choosing to stay when no one would have blamed him for leaving. History remembers victories. It remembers aces and machines and formations. But sometimes history pivots on something quieter, on a man who refuses to abandon others even when the cost is almost everything he has. Howard didn't win that fight because he was invincible. He won it because he was relentless, because he never gave the enemy what they expected, and because courage, when combined with skill, can bend probability itself. 60 bombers returned that day. 600 men stepped back onto English soil. They went on to live full lives, families, children, futures that would have ended in smoke and fire if one pilot had turned away. Howard lived too, long enough to watch new generations take the sky he once fought for, long enough to know that what he did wasn't repeatable and never should be. Heroics aren't doctrine. They are exceptions born of necessity. But on January 11th, 1944, necessity called for one thing only: stay. One pilot, one aircraft. 37 minutes that reshaped an air war and saved hundreds of lives. Not because he was ordered to, but because he chose to be there when it mattered most. And that is why decades later, his story still matters, not as a tale of destruction, but as proof of what determination can achieve when everything else is gone. Years passed. The war moved on. Then it ended. The skies over Europe fell silent, but the lessons forged in combat did not. Fighter pilots who came after James Howard trained in a world shaped by what he proved that day. They learned to think offensively, to seize initiative, to understand that hesitation in the air was often deadlier than enemy fire. Manuals changed. Doctrine evolved. But at the core of it all was a simple truth. Air superiority was not claimed by caution, but by resolve. Howard returned home quietly. No parades, no speeches. He stayed in uniform, flew jets, tested new aircraft, helped prepare a new generation for wars yet to come. He never chased the story of January 11th. He never needed to. The men who mattered already knew it. Across America, bomber crews built lives that should have ended over Germany. They married, they raised children, they grew old. And every one of those futures traced back to a single winter morning when a lone fighter stayed where it didn't have to. Howard lived long enough to see his actions become history, to see the Mustang remembered as the fighter that helped win the air war, to see young pilots speak his name with quiet respect, not because of how many enemy aircraft he destroyed, but because of how many people he saved. When he passed away, there were no formations overhead, no roaring engines in salute. But his legacy was already written across decades of aviation history. It lived in every escort mission that reached its target and came home intact. In every pilot taught to protect those who could not protect themselves. Some battles are won by armies. Some wars are shaped by machines. But every so often, history turns on a single moment when one person decides that leaving is not an option. On January 11th, 1944, James Howard made that choice. And because he did, hundreds of lives went on. That is how the story ends. History often remembers wars through maps and dates, arrows on charts, lines advancing and retreating. But the truth of war lives elsewhere, inside moments that never make it into strategy books. Moments when no one is watching, when no order is given, when a single decision carries the weight of hundreds of lives. January 11th, 1944 was one of those moments. There was no grand plan that morning calling for one fighter to stand alone. No doctrine that demanded a pilot stay until his guns were empty and his fuel nearly gone. What happened over Germany was not designed. It emerged from necessity, instinct, and responsibility. James Howard didn't wake up intending to become a symbol. He took off to do a job to escort bombers as far as he was told, and to come home if he could. But war rarely respects intention. It demands choice. And when that choice came, he made it without hesitation. In the years that followed, the story spread quietly, passed from pilot to pilot, from instructor to student, not as a tale of hero worship, but as a reminder of what the mission truly meant. Protect those who cannot protect themselves. Hold the line when others depend on you. Understand that sometimes the cost of leaving is greater than the risk of staying. The sky James Howard fought in no longer exists. The aircraft are gone. The men are gone. But the standard remains. Every time a pilot stays with a vulnerable formation, every time someone chooses duty over self-preservation, Every time courage fills the gap where plans fall apart, that legacy lives on. The battle ended in 37 minutes. The lesson endured for generations. Because on one winter morning in thin air and freezing cold, a single pilot proved something timeless. That one person in the right place at the right moment can hold back the impossible. And that sometimes history doesn't change because of orders given, but because someone chose to stay. In the end, there was no explosion that marked the moment history changed. No headline announced it. No trumpet sounded in the sky over Germany. The world simply kept moving because 600 men were still alive to move within it. That is how most turning points happen. James Howard didn't see himself as the center of a story. He saw himself as a barrier, something that stood in the way long enough for others to escape. When his guns ran dry, he used speed. When speed ran out, he used nerve. When logic failed, he used will. And when there was nothing left to give, he stayed anyway. The war rolled on. More missions were flown. More battles were fought. But something fundamental had shifted. The enemy learned that American fighters would not simply escort and withdraw. They would pursue. They would dominate. And they would not abandon those placed in their care. Long after the last Mustang landed and the last bomber shut down its engines, the meaning of that day endured. Not in medals or citations, but in the quiet understanding shared by those who had been there. That survival sometimes depends not on plans or numbers, but on whether one person refuses to step aside. Howard never asked to be remembered, but memory has a way of clinging to moments when the cost of courage is absolute. His story endured because it spoke to something timeless, the idea that duty does not end when the odds turn hopeless. On January 11, 1944, over a frozen stretch of enemy sky, one pilot stayed when leaving made sense. He stayed when no one would have judged him for turning away.